want to get on our email list and you're not on it, just add your name. Add your address on that sheet. If you're on Zoom and not on our email list and would like to be, put your email in the chat. You'll just receive 1 or 2 emails a week reminding you about the upcoming talk and giving you the Zoom link. Please do mute yourself. Looks like everyone has on Zoom. But as always, you can use the raise hand function during Q&A. So you can unmute and ask your question live when we call on you. So next week, we'll conclude the semester, as we always do in the spring, with Roger Chartier, who will talk about Revolution and Erasure, France, 1789. We hope you can join us for that one as well. It's a great pleasure today to welcome Penn's own Michael Gamer for his 3rd time speaking at the workshop, along with his collaborator, Deven Parker, once upon a time of the University of Pennsylvania, but now of the University of Glasgow for her 1st time speaking to the workshop. Michael is professor of English and currently director of graduate studies here at Penn. I looked up in our database, which you can find at pennmaterialtext.org, and found that he first spoke to this group in 1999, and then again in 2013. And so now he's back for his tridecennial presentation in 2026. Michael is the general editor of the Cambridge edition of the works of Anne Radcliffe, for which his own edition of The Italian has just appeared. And as a general editor, I put that first, even ahead of the scholarly monograph, because I think it's a huge task and an important one. He's also published several scholarly monographs, including Romanticism and the Gothic, Cambridge 2000, Self-Canonization and the Business of Poetry, Cambridge 2017, and he was part of the so-called Multigraph Collective that wrote Interacting with Print, Modes of Reading in the Age of Print, Saturation, Chicago 2018. He has collaboratively edited, often with alumni of Penn, a number of important texts and anthologies, including Women's Travel Writing in India, Volume 2, Lyrical Ballads, and the Broadview Anthology of Romantic Drama. His courses on Jane Austen are legendary around here, and he's received numerous teaching awards, including the Abrams and Lindback Awards. He recently spent 4 years at Queen Mary University of London as part of the inaugural cohort of the innovative British Academy Global Professorships, and we're very glad to have him back. Deven Parker is a Leverhulme Early Career Postdoctoral Fellow in English at the University of Glasgow. She was an English major here at Penn, and I know some of you taught her way back then, graduating in 2012, and then went on to do her PhD at the University of Colorado, which she earned in 2019. From 2020 to 2024, she was a postdoctoral research associate at Queen Mary, working with Michael on the romantic melodrama project that he headed up. And as part of that project, they're compiling a performance database of every performance of melodrama in the British Isles from 1793 to 1843. Deven's book, Romantic Media and Wartime Networks, will appear from Stanford this year. I'm quoting from the website. It tells the story of how Britain revolutionized its state communication networks during the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, setting the stage for our modern infrastructure state where connectivity and surveillance go hand in hand. Sounds like a fascinating book. At Glasgow, she's working on the various copyright regimes of the theater and the book trade and how they differed in the period, and how those regimes shaped the careers of romantic writers and the development of the concept of intellectual property. Tonight, they'll present on Slow History on Stage and Page, the Other Burney Collection. So please join me in welcoming them both to the front of the room.
Just a quick note, we have 2 large print access copies of our talk. If anyone requires them, please let Priya know. First, thank you so much to Zach Lesser, to John Pollock, to Jerry Singerman, and to Priya Nambrath for inviting us to share this material with you all. And also thank you to the Leverhulme Trust for funding my part of the archival work for this project. We cover all our thank yous.
We did. Let me just start things up, and Priya, let me know if I'm doing it right. So do we have it?
Did you share it?
No. You see, this is why I need help. Oh,
Down at the bottom.
there we go. Bingo. Now it's just a matter of getting Zoom to get out of the way. And there we go.
Okay. Many of you may recognize the name of Charles Burney Jr., either from his connections to his more famous father and sister, or from the Burney collection of early English newspapers held at the British Library and digitized by Gale. That archive is but a small fraction of his library that was sold to the British Museum after Burney's death in 1817. Over 13,000 books, 500 manuscript volumes, and the aforementioned newspapers, and finally over 300 volumes of materials related to the stage. Burney's biographers tell us that this final collection was for a history of the English stage, never completed. While we don't know when exactly Burney began amassing materials, we know Charles Burney Sr. frequently took his 5 young children to the theater. First at Lynn, later at Norwich, and still later in London after the family's move to the city in the late 1760s. During Charles Jr.'s youth, the Burney home played host to many eminent actors and playwrights, including David Garrick and Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and it's not impossible to imagine such frequent contact fueling his desire to collect the stuff of the theater. Beyond this interest in the stage, Charles Burney Jr. demonstrated a lifelong passion, even a pathology, for collecting. Still in his teens at Cambridge, he was expelled for stealing 92 rare and valuable books from the university library, an incident that prevented his ability to enter the church and colored his career as a schoolmaster. In her recent book on the Burneys, Sophie Colombo, who I believe is joining us via Zoom, notes that Burney stole the classical text to assemble his own personal library. These are images from her book of his book plates, remnants of Burney's book plates that are in the Cambridge books that he attempted to steal and pass as his own. We might see this early interest in book arts of cutting and reassembling text as early training ground for his later forays into assembling the materials of a theater history. Heather Jackson has called Burney a keen starter and a poor finisher, largely because his planned publications never saw print. Yet, as Michael and I have combed through his hundreds of volumes of playbills, press cuttings, notebooks, and prints held at the BL and the British Museum, we found ourselves wishing to consider this collection not as the means to a failed end, but as an end in itself.
So on the display there, you'll see we've grabbed some things from the Kislak collection, which is some actually really wonderful things. On the left is a Grangerized edition of the history of the theater, where the scrapbooker has taken a history of the theater and cut it up and then inserted several hundred plates from the theater. In the middle just is a scrapbook that contains some theatrical stuff, but mostly not, to give you an idea of classical scrapbooking. And then on the right is a really interesting bit from the Forrester collection, bless you. That's not the name of the collection, that's just bless you for Dev. That's almost all playbills, but they're collected Philadelphia during the time, as the scrapbooker puts it, of the rebellion, 1861 to 1865. One of the reasons they're useful is because they incorporate many of the technologies that we're about to describe in Charles Burney's collection, and yet they do not do what Charles Burney is doing in really any way, shape, or form. These are sort of more the ingredients to the gumbo that we're going to argue that Burney is creating. So one of the questions, and can everyone hear me all right? The mic's good. One of the questions that Charles Burney posed to himself through his collecting practices is a simple one. What exactly constitutes theater history? For he begins his activities at a time when theater history was heavily centered in anecdotes, gossip, and memoir. histories, in this case, in quotation marks, histories of the green room, histories of actors and performers, and of individual theaters. And though flirting with these older modes of theatrical history, Burney's notebooks show him primarily compiling what we now call ephemera, all kinds, to create a sort of documentary history, a temporal chronicle made out of mixed media, sometimes spotlighting specific performers or troupes, but always through a montage or mosaic, really a mosaic of handwritten notes, newspaper cuttings, playbills, ticket stubs, receipts, reviews, ads, and correspondence. This strikes us, even though we're talking about older technologies going back to antiquity, medieval, early modern times. This strikes us as a deeply innovative enterprise, even as it wields long-standing information management technologies like note-taking, commonplacing, scrapbooking techniques that we equate and that have been vividly described by scholars like Anne Blair, Richard Yeo, Gillian Hess, and Stefan Muller-Wille and Isabelle Chamontier. What Deven and I are trying to work out, that is beyond understanding how these 300 and something volumes developed and came into being, is to what degree we might read their very real strangeness as endemically tied to the nature of performance itself. And beyond that, what does it mean to record ephemeral performance primarily through documents that we would classify also as ephemeral? First, collecting the playbills of local theaters around his hometown of Lynn and nearby Ipswich and Bury St. Edmunds, and then those in London. Burney lived through a period, and the slide here is about that explosion. Burney lived through a period that saw an explosion of minor and provincial theaters, both in London and outside in the provinces. And with these, the ascent of new so-called illegitimate dramatic forms like melodrama, burletta, hippodrama, and extravaganza. That's just naming a few. We suspect that these years of expansion and change fueled his desire to preserve what might otherwise be forgotten. He's a bit of a hoarder, and where there's an urgency in his amassing of materials. I think of him as a completionist, but I also think of someone who's dealing with how to complete something that's always like the universe expanding. So with the urgency and the completionist tendencies, there's an ever-growing sense of scale that's kind of exponential. It's not even linear. So here's how the Burney currently cataloged at the British Library. I'm not going to read these off. You can see these are classified as notebooks and press cuttings, many volumes. And then there are collections of playbills. So here we are again. And you get now, these titles were developed not by Burney, but by the British Library catalogers who had to make sense of the collection, which is what we've been trying to do. For them, apparently, the existence of playbills in any given volume was a key factor in distinguishing them from those they called notebooks. There was also, I think, a temporal element here, since you'll notice that the volumes classified as notebooks tend to come from and cover earlier years, while the playbill volumes are mostly later and taken from Burney's own lifetime. Part of that's what he was able to collect, but also I think there's a kind of interesting break there that we haven't fully sussed out. What is clear is when you actually look through all these volumes, those containing playbills are also notebooks. They don't consist entirely of playbills at all. They're comprised of the same array of materials plus playbills and wield many of the same organizational methods and bookmaking strategies that the other volumes do. Even the so-called Garrick volumes are not only Garrick. They spend ample time chronicling the career of dozens of actors and playwrights other than Garrick, sort of within his orbit, as if Garrick's a sort of sun and they are planets. But also they chronicle the histories of theaters other than Drury Lane. So they are Garrick volumes, but not. Beyond imagining the history of the theater via a succession of ever more expansive ontological systems, the volumes show us Burney working through, and we think, having been processing these, trying on, almost like you would close, a range of strategies for organizing and managing theatrical traces. They're ontological systems, but they're also sort of ad hoc tinkering. These strategies overlap and accrue over the course of volumes, particularly in later years, when Burney finds himself confronted with even more material than his scaffolding could have ever anticipated. Put another way, even though the volumes have been divided by catalogers into different sets, they appear, at least in our estimation, at least in their current state, because many of these were rebounded, later on, to be part of an overarching, single, chronological project that was never fully completed because it extended into Burney's present, and he simply couldn't keep up with the materials. So let's talk about the notebooks. And let me start from the earlier years. As you can see, these volumes, now we're going to move faster. As you can see, these early volumes are quite thin and mostly white space, to be honest, as you can see from these images. The volumes you're viewing, though covering the earliest years of the collection, from what we can tell, were created fairly late in the game, since they are filled with, not here, but in the next image you'll see it, since they're filled with bits of what appear to have been earlier notebooks. So you can see here, especially the middle image, there's a little cut and paste job. And on the right image, he's decided not to cut and paste, in fact, just to include an entire pamphlet, which is his practice most of the time. This process of repurposing earlier work shows Burney also flirting with various forms of tabulation. Here, for example, you see him reusing an old letter, some old correspondence. You'll note the postmark to do the job. But what the volumes do show nicely is that Burney discovered, I think, a really compelling synergy between the quarto codex and the theatrical season. The bulk of the volumes are not just chronological. They think and proceed one volume and one season at a time. The slim volumes of the early years quickly yield to thicker ones as periodicals multiply and more information becomes available, until finally the codices become downright unwieldy as the number of theaters in London and elsewhere continues to grow. Yet at the same time, the volumes repeatedly show Burney engaging in another kind of bookmaking, taking his own earlier work and reassembling it to accommodate some new, sometimes he's whimsical and goes back to old systems, but some new organizational system, or, as we see here, simply repeating the same work as new materials become available. Let me make sure I'm on the right slide here. Yeah. So here, for example, we think on this page that he is experimenting first with one version of chronicling the theatrical season 1735 to 1736, and then with another. You can see on the left page that he's tipped in materials for May of 1736, but then you'll see on the right a page announcing a new section, which repeats roughly the same theatrical season, although this time, controversially, it promises to extend it through the end of summer. One has no idea whether he did the same season twice intentionally, or whether he forgot his earlier work and later discovered it, or whether he just came back with new materials and said, screw this, I'm just going to do it again, or whether the two slimmer volumes holding similar materials were later bound together. As this volume was rebound in the 1930s, it's hard to know. And once Burney begins ransacking his own newspaper collection, we sense that too much of a good thing might indeed be at once intoxicating and wonderful. As the years progress, you can see in the right-hand notebook, for example, the one that's turned on its side because I couldn't fit it otherwise, on this slide, that the wealth of materials are beginning to threaten, even to overwhelm, the organizational apparatus set out to contain them. Within the collection, moreover, there is at least one volume that appears to be one of these earlier notebooks, a sort of daybook where Burney has written notes and pasted ads. Here's more of a close-up of it so you can see more closely. Here you can see the Chronicle is in the process of overtaking this earlier version. You can see that he's been pasting in announcements from 1758. So the pastes are all from the same year, and he's just pasting them on top of more haphazard and more chronologically diverse note-taking. This is what we mean when we say that various volumes experiment with different ways of creating a documentary theater history, trying out different approaches, taking sometimes a geographical focus, sometimes when centered either in star performers or in particularly famous theatrical troupes, sometimes moving from one new playwright to another new playwright. He varies. Another interesting aspect, though, is the frequency with which he takes the finished products of older systems of theater history, particularly author biographies, but also biographies of the stage and the green room, and then he cuts them up to redistribute them into his own system, and not in a way that we would say is Grangerization, not like, say, the left-hand volume on display there. I'm not sure that this is, as I said, I think this is more than Grangerization. I'm not sure what to call it, re-ephemeralizing something, but we find entire chapters or bits of chapters of Jeremy Collier, of Cibber's Apology, of Garrick's biography dispersed, and of later accounts by James Bowden and autobiographies by people like Thomas John Dibdin, distributed into the vast scaffolding of an unwieldy chronicle where different strands of theatrical history unfold contemporaneously in real time. Contemporaneously in real time, that's the goal, we think. Sometimes achieved and sometimes incomplete, but always with more hunting, gathering, cutting, and pasting needed to create the finished fantasy mosaic. In all this, though, the codex rules the roost. Time may expand and contract. You have one volume that covers 40 years, but a later one covers merely a few months because there's so much stuff. But the chosen form is always the codex, eventually filled to bursting.
I'll now move to the so-called playbill volumes in the collection. We can see how this part of the collection uses many of the note-taking and excerpting techniques that Michael introduced. But the crucial difference here is that now Burney is writing a history of his present, or at least of theater during his adult lifetime. And suddenly, the playbill becomes his primary medium. This is a page from one of Burney's earliest volumes of playbills. It offers, I think, a nice snapshot of how his project began. He collects and arranges bills for performances that took place in his birthplace of Lynn, starting in November of 1773, when he was 16 years old. The troupe in question was based in nearby Norwich. From this initial bill, the volume proceeds chronologically, documenting the troupe's movements across the region's theaters. This volume and others point to Burney's interest in the importance of provincial theaters, which form a crucial part of British theater history alongside those of London, despite our field's historical bias for the metropolis. But as I'll later show, his desire for inclusivity poses a problem as the years progress and the number of theaters exponentially multiplies. At a material level, this volume shows how bills are folded to adhere to the quarto format. The volume structure follows the Norwich's troops' movements across the region, here from Bury St. Edmunds to Ipswich. In other words, the goal here appears to be to record a chronology of performance events by a troupe rather than a history of any single theater building. When we move to Burney's London playbill volumes, his organizational heuristic expands to accommodate London's 3 patent houses operating from the 1760s. We are no longer focusing on a single troupe. Still, as with the previous 2 provincial volumes, time, rather than say location, remains the core ordering principle for the playbills. Proceeding chronologically, each volume alternates between Drury Lane, Covent Garden, and the Haymarket. At the same time, it's in these early London volumes that things get messier, in part because Burney must deal with the incompleteness of his own collection. Where he doesn't have a bill for a given night, he has recourse to the newspaper, to its listings, ads, and reviews to document a given performance, and using the same techniques that we see in the earlier notebooks that Michael was showing you. We usually class the majority of printed matter generated by theatrical performance, whether it's playbills or ads or ticket stubs or posters, simply as ephemera. But in Burney's proliferating volumes, it's clear that there is a hierarchy within this category. Though it's never explicitly said, Michael and I are convinced that Burney prefers the playbill when it is available, likely because it manages to provide considerably more information in a single page, and that page can be neatly pasted into a quarto volume. It's here where we also see Burney develop his editorial apparatus. In the London volumes, he begins to create and attach what we might think of as a table of contents. For each month, he'll provide a list of plays, and then next to that play's title, put the number, date for the bill where it's listed. This method allows him to quickly find and access bills for particular titles. So you'll recognize these tables from Michael's earlier slides, but here they're being repurposed in a different way from the earlier volumes. They announce the playbills and ads that will follow rather than serving as ends in and of themselves. In the slide up currently, we can see that his left-hand table of contents lists the comedy 'Tis Well, It's No Worse as occurring on November 24th. And here's the corresponding playbill. It's at this point that he's thinking both about the volume's organization and designing it to be used. Next, the volume for London in 1775 and 76 is where we really see Burney's robust organization and editorial apparatus at work. Building on the framework he developed for earlier London performances, in this volume, he offers a succinct, orderly play-by-play of the history of the stage in London for this season, even opening the volume with a title page, accompanied by the lead performers for each. He then provides a full list of the company for both Drury Lane and Covent Garden. It's at this point where I think you can really see Burney not just collecting ephemera, but actually making his theater history. He's setting the stage, as it were, for the performance listings through this prefatory material. The volumes here begin to feel less like compilations of pure data and commentary for future use, and more like fully formed works. In this volume, for example, he provides an editorial summary for each month of the 1775-76 season, where he lists major or noteworthy events. These include opening night performances, new preludes, and the return of key performers, and even deaths, as when he lists the death of Mrs. Johnson, the housekeeper of Drury Lane. It's only at this point he begins to intersperse the playbills themselves, or handwritten approximations of them when he doesn't have a bill or a clipping, with other materials that thicken his theatrical history. These include printed prologues, as with the middle image, and ones that he's actually copied out himself, as with the right-hand image. This is the method Burney uses across his volumes for London in the 1770s, 80s, and 90s. It is meticulous in scope. Each month opens with a listing of main piece performances, as well as notes on new performers, deaths, and other key events. Though the London volumes mainly document London's patent houses, they also include minor venues such as Goodman's Fields, not to mention private theatricals where possible. So far from being a patent house snob, Burney's collecting practices favor a broadly inclusive approach to anything that might be considered performance. So here, for example, are announcements for a Pantheon concert and a reading of Romeo and Juliet at a pub near Reading. So you can see he really includes anything that you might consider a performance, period. Yet, as the volumes move into the 1790s, Burney clearly has trouble maintaining this meticulous approach. The volume for London's 1790-91 season feels curiously incomplete compared to the 70s and 80s examples. There's still an attempt here to create this editorial apparatus, as you can see on the title page on the left, but we also start to see Burney tipping in blank pages, as on the center and right images, between his playbills. At the top of each of these is usually a date and a theater name. So you can see here Wednesday, September 22nd, 1790, and Covent Garden's CG. So he knows that a performance took place, but he doesn't have the materials, whether the playbill or the news clipping. Or perhaps he doesn't have the personal capacity to include it. So instead, he just interleaves a largely blank page. At the end of this particular volume, we get something very suggestive. A number of blank sheets of various sizes tipped into the volume. It's as if for this particular theatrical season, Burney anticipated having to add more performances and preemptively inserted placeholders for them, but then never completed the entries. These blank pages indicate the degree to which Burney's theatrical history remained very much a work in progress. Elsewhere in the 1791 volume, Burney's editorial apparatus is highly developed and meticulous. He includes a list not just of new main pieces, but also new farces, interludes, and other afterpieces, once again suggesting that comprehensiveness is the guiding heuristic. The volume also includes a full list of plays with cast lists for Drury Lane and Covent Garden across the entire theatrical year. The numbers to the left of the play title indicate the page where the playbill or the newspaper ad can be found in the book that Burney has assembled. This side-by-side approach allows the book's user to compare theatrical offerings at both stages for the same date. Burney uses ruled lines to organize and separate his entries, and, where relevant, corrects information by pasting over it with a small paper cutting, as you can see on our middle and right images. What I find interesting about this particular approach is that he doesn't fully cover the old information with the scrap, allowing the user to fold it back just enough to compare the correction with the content underneath. So the goal here seems to be not to replace the play title entirely, but rather to indicate a change of title in the way that playbills do when they notify the public that a given play can't be performed because of an actor's illness. Reading Burney's history of the stage, then, is a tactile, interactive experience, just as the process of making it involved cutting, pasting, and ruling lines. To draw on Deirdre Lynch's analysis of romantic albums, Burney's books are not so much stable, fixed objects, but rather, quote, a more fluid sort of assemblage comprising discrete, manipulatable parts. Burney's collection proceeds in this fashion until the beginnings of the Regency, where suddenly his system unravels entirely. Volumes after this point include no cast lists, no list of plays, anything like that. Instead, one playbill simply follows another, without explanation, without framing. My best guess as to the cause of the breakdown in his system is that it lies either in Burney's ill health around this time, or I think equally likely in the explosion of minor theaters in London during the Regency, which makes it nearly impossible for him to sustain the practice of earlier theatrical years. Because now, alongside Drury Lane, Covent Garden, and the Haymarket, we see playbills, as you can see here, for Sadler's Wells, the Surrey Theatre, the English Opera House, the Tottenham, and the Adelphi. Burney's system is not the only one that broke down in these years. By 1815, the theatrical calendar had as well. In the decades where the patent theaters had dominated, September to May had been the long-standing norm, with the Haymarket providing entertainment during the summer months by renting a Covent Garden or Drury Lane patent. But London's new theaters did not have patents, nor did they have to play by the same rules. They might have been barred from performing spoken legitimate drama, but they were not bound to other traditions as well, operating throughout the year in ways that invoke our own shift to a 24-hour news cycle. Yet even as these final volumes abandon aspects of Burney's editorial apparatus, they still uphold the collection's core principle of slow chronology, proceeding day by day rather than by theater or performer, as one playbill follows the next. Equally, they continue the inclusive approach we saw in the earlier volumes. Burney deems every one of London's minor theaters worthy of inclusion in his history of the stage. This is in spite of the fact that the BL conservation team that rebound his collection in the 1930s clearly displays a bias in favor of the patent theaters, inaccurately printing on their bindings DL, so Drury Lane, CG, Covent Garden, etc. Their contents, however, include playbills for theaters across and just outside of London, adhering to the larger collection's principle of being as comprehensive as possible. Yet it was likely this very principle that caused Burney's once robust editorial framework to become too unwieldy to sustain.
So where does this leave us? In writing about the period's dominant modes of popular history and how you compile them, Philip Connell, who's over at Cambridge, has pointed to the Romantics' fondness for, and the Romantics, even the Romantics' fascination with what he calls, and this is a quote from Philip, anecdotes, miscellanies, and curiosities of the literary past, arranged either in the form of a life or biography, or as an informative and entertaining series of historical vignettes. However, unquote. However, in Burney's collection and arrangement of materials, we find him doing decidedly, if Connell is right, Burney's doing something decidedly not of his time. Whether it's futuristic or a throwback, you can decide. For rather than attempting or narrating telling episodes of various epochs, Burney instead attempted to chronicle the history of performance through a vast mixed media assemblage of documents of print and manuscript ephemera, organized by, though not necessarily stabilized by, the form of the codex. The drive here is not to create a series of entertaining exempla that capture the spirit of the age, but rather to create a system capable of containing every recordable trace of a nation's performances, and to do so in a way that allows for the activities of the collector, the ever restless collecting urge to continue as empty spaces are filled in subsequent codices. We might want to think about Tiladama Rajan's work on John Hunter's anatomy collections of the period, where she describes this as a sort of never-ending project, or there's the Deleuzian idea where a great work is also a chaos that contains all the complicated series, all the ways things could play in and out, all the things which lead out and then back in. Certainly these volumes, for all their yearning to contain and present a complete and knowable world, cannot help but chronicle Burney's attempts over and over again to adjust, revise, remake, and reimagine his edifice as he goes along, as the theatrical universe continues to expand, and even exponentially so. In this sense, the collection's more than 300 codices constitute their own piece, and I really do believe this. It's a piece of performance art. In this case, of the theatrical past and present, thinking of that as a continual work in progress. And that's what we got.
Thank you.
Unshare.
Yes.
And thanks for being.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Floor is open. The Zoom is open to the question.
Very quick factual question. I just didn't catch this. So he bound them himself, and then the BL later on in the 30s rebound. Is that right?
We think.
That's our understanding, but it's been really challenging to try to figure out exactly the material process here at play.
But there wasn't, let's say, a mess of foul papers that his heirs had to come along and find. It was
The original volumes findings look like this, and they often have penciled in dates that
Got it,
are,
okay.
that are in his handwriting.
Okay.
And
that
then
makes sense.
the pictures you saw of the more the more maroon, the darker
That was the
colors,
BL
those we're pretty sure were rebound in the
in the
30s.
30s. Okay, but according to the way in which well, no, actually not according to the way, because they seem to have made their own choice. Okay, that's
Yeah, they look like they created those carefully tipped in paper inserts with
Yeah.
playbill attached and the fold. I'm wondering if
Yeah.
that's all the 30s, the modern, you can see the modern paper attached to a playbill, and that really looks like a.
Yeah, for the
Concert.
playbills, we aren't sure. I mean, again, like it's actually really hard to access these, and then they bring out 80 of them, right?
right.
So, right, and you're waiting for the other, and half of them are sort of running around, all the visual stuff has been taken away and is at the British Museum and the prints and drawings.
Oh,
So it's been broken apart. We have no idea how those were integrated or not.
so you didn't even mention that.
Yeah, we didn't have,
Yeah.
we wanted to.
We already went over time.
Yeah,
so-
I think they're part of the theater collection.
Yeah.
And I was told by someone at the British Museum that they were separated and put into the British Library or into the British Museum when the BL had its own building.
Yeah.
That all prints and art were
Yeah.
at the British Museum. But I think they're part of the same theater
Creates a
collection.
new set of problems, yeah.
But are they bound together?
The prints have been unbound, but they were bound.
They were bound, but it's
They
not
were
clear whether
unbound.
they were bound with the other material.
No, because they've unbound them now.
Yeah.
So there's no way to know what they were unbound from.
And what about the ones that are still in the bindings?
The visual ones or,
You said there's some of them are still bound in bindings
did
like this
say.
one.
well, but not the visual stuff, the ephemera. So when you get like the 56 Garrick volumes, some look like, you can't, some look like the ones we showed you, the lineup
Yeah.
of volumes.
Yeah.
And then others
Look
have
like
that
that.
kind of binding, and they'll be mixed, right? Where 24 of them will be rebound, and then they'll have 5 or 6 regular ones.
But of the ones that haven't been rebound, is there any visual material in them? No.
None.
It's just interesting to think about the ones that are bound or rebound in the whole.
Yeah,
I mean, is there a sense of?
The prints from the
Yeah.
theater stuff.
Do you think, because I realize just this discussion is really helping. I realize that I've simply assumed, because I've looked at these codices and the original ones are clearly 18th century, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I
no,
do know that he always kept them separate, but I don't know that.
Hmm.
And now I'm really wondering, like, when did that separation occur? Was that a Charles Burney
don't know.
separation? Like, did he have separate
Yeah.
volumes where he just collected prints and alphabetized
Yeah.
them? And, I don't know.
I think yes, because he created his own catalog for just prints.
Okay.
Oh,
so-
so
Yeah.
okay, so he had a separate catalog.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
I mean, can you tell with the playbills, they're tipped in now, but were they previously sewn in? Or, I mean, that would indicate whether that happened later or
I'm just gonna
earlier.
Look at my images.
Hold on.
Sorry.
we can look. No, no, this is good. This is exactly, keep going down.
Oh, yeah.
Other direction. Like, okay,
These look modern, some of them.
some of them are, yeah. So one wonders
Oh, but then
whether,
this one though looks,
yeah,
How would they have been bound? I mean, if they had been bound in playbills, you would have some indication of like something happening, whether they're bound together.
yeah, you know what? I think that they were bound because I'm just thinking now,
Yeah.
I took out the slide, but he often uses other period paper as backing paper
Yeah.
for them. And so there's one volume where he uses sheet music
Yeah,
to bind them. So I think that, yeah, I think that he did bind them. I'm pretty sure.
yeah,
but
but then they got.
He-
Yeah.
But has he attached them to sheet music or has he
Yes.
treated?
Yeah.
Okay, so they were glued or whatever they did
Yeah.
do something else, and so the whatever the binding would have been through the sheet music and not the playbill. Okay, so,
Oh,
sorry.
No, but it's also clear from other volumes that they must have been falling to bits or, because when they rebind, a lot of the time they're redoing it, though meticulously in chronological order, so. And in ways that utterly match the ones where it's clear that that's Burney's work. So they kept things consistent, I think. They tried to keep each chunk.
Oh, yeah, no, I got that. It was just
Yeah.
more about, if.
No, I'm thinking with you aloud, but
If they're creating the tipping and it's, it's just white paper, are they taking things off of something and then creating this new, but you'd have to really pay attention to that. I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I mean, these questions about format, original format notwithstanding. If I'm understanding correctly, I'm seeing this kind of huge and wonderful paradox as you talk about Burney throughout and the personality of Burney as the collector, the collection becomes a kind of autobiography of Burney. You haven't mentioned whether he notes which of those plays he's seen or not. So is there a record of Burney?
I took some of that out, but I can.
So is there a record of Burney as the theater goer?
Yes.
Here?
Although interestingly, I would say that he tends to not add personal touches. By and large, he takes the kind of cold, detached, objective editorial perspective, but there are a couple instances. So one that I was again originally in my slides and I took out, there's a performance that he says his sisters attended, and Garrick was supposed to perform and was ill, so the play was changed, and he says it wasn't very good.
Yeah.
So there are occasionally like personal anecdotes, but I would say that those are pretty rare.
Yeah, so it's really going for some kind of comprehensiveness rather than any kind of
Personal.
critical or personal
Mhm. Yeah.
assessment of.
Yeah. I would say he does not play the role of reviewer often.
Yeah.
That is true of Furness's playbill collection as well, right? If I'm remembering, he doesn't really often say which ones he's seen or.
No,
It's
it's
really
really
just
just writes
asking
dates.
us.
That's
Just
about
trying to
it.
get
Like
them.
some dates like there,
Mhm.
yeah.
But then elsewhere in this period, so Michael and I are writing a larger book about the playbill as a medium, as a form, and people frequently do use the playbill as specifically a way to review performances. Like they'll kind of perform the role of reviewer in the space of the playbill. So I think it does function as that.
Yeah,
frequently.
but there's like a bifurcation between people maybe who are trying to do that, which is a small collection.
Yeah.
Pleasant to see.
Yeah.
Versus people who are just gathering, trying to do the completest.
Mhm.
Are you gonna ask about John Backer?
Well, I mean,
Because this is so reminiscent. It's like-
there's John Baker, but it's like exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
very much similar, but it is kind of related to this conversation and Backford it always is. And that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that this is a collection towards an imagined history or a proposed history of the theater.
That's what everyone tells us, but Burney
Right.
doesn't say.
I guess that's what I was wondering is, because, with Bagford, he was collecting towards a proposed history of the book, although it's not quite sure whether he's doing it. He starts collecting and then it becomes interesting to him that this could be something more. But I'm just kind of curious that there's a couple projects like this. Like I think Joseph Ames also in the 18th century was doing similar. I mean, there's like actually quite a number of them. And they all seem to be pushing towards like the idea of a monograph history of something. And I'm just thinking about how the collecting of fragments goes together with that historiographic kind of impulse. And they're kind of two, like they're obverse, things. And also wondering, does in the Burney materials, is there any sense of like an aesthetics of the collection in the sense of like arrangement or like, because part of the thing that interests me with these collections is that you collect and you organize, like you're saying, you're using the codex book to kind of pull these things together, but there's a way in which the codex album starts to imitate the kind of proposed histories they want to write, and then they realize that the ephemera actually exceeds the history they could possibly write, which would be 10,000 pages long if they actually wrote it, and so it's kind of, I'm kind of interested in how like the narrativizing of this thing goes together with the collecting that you're describing, because it seems like there's an arrangement, but there also seems to be a lot of just you're a space to hand to be used, right?
In some ways, so one of the questions, everything you just said is, yeah, I just was nodding the whole way. So one of the questions that we're trying to figure out is, given that this is something people are doing in the 18th century, does trying to do it for the stage, history of ephemeral performance, does that change things or raise the stakes or just shift them? Does the axis rotate or does the project somehow have slightly different dimensions, right? So, and I don't know the answer to that yet. I would say probably, which is why I got really interested, sort of coming back to say Jerry's question, not at points where Burney is inserting himself, but where I could see him making choices and thinking, right? Where he changes his mind, or he's been doing something one way, and then you just see him abandon that way and take on another method. And we were trying in our slides to sort of foreground moments where we become aware that he's trying on another system, right? You want to?
I was going to say too, I think that you can see kind of shift in the collection between, on the one hand, like raw materials for a future narrative history, especially in the notebooks that Michael looked at. But then I think with the playbill volumes, especially the ones that have like a very curated editorial approach, like it seems to become the actual history itself. I think a lot of those were created on the later end of this project. So my sense is that maybe those are turning into the narrative history that he maybe realizes he's not ever going to complete. I had a question. Do those other creators actually write the thing?
I mean, Bagford wrote like a dictionary entry about the history of printing, that was like a fragment that was, and he published in the Philosophical Transactions his proposal towards writing this. So there is evidence that he wanted to write it, but which maybe there isn't with Burney, but that's really interesting that towards the end, you're seeing that the album itself becomes the publication.
Yeah.
I do think these serve as an interesting kind of publication. Like, I don't know what it would be with Burney, but certainly some of Bagford's albums were on public view, like at the British Museum, so people could go and consult them as if it was a written history, even though it was a singular object, right? So it's like maybe he's anticipating an audience for these beyond himself, curating for his own.
And I do think that if we want to think about monetizing something, or how certain collections become known and celebrated and therefore become sort of authored books in and of themselves, the fact that on his death, the British Museum bought everything. They knew, and either worst case scenario, someone persuaded them to buy it, but I think more likely they knew and they wanted it. And certainly, like, I've grown up using that newspaper collection, right? There's no way that you could do theater history, at least stage history, without that Burney collection, right? Because it's the only place you're going to find reviews of plays. Otherwise we just couldn't do it.
I wonder if I don't know, I kept hearing so many echoes of what I know about Bagford, which comes from Whitney, where, as I recall, you also kind of end up arguing that this is the history ultimately.
Yeah.
And I wonder if Burney knew the back. It's right there for him in the British Museum.
Right.
It looks very similar.
Very
different.
similar.
So I think it's worth looking at that as an he really might have seen it.
Whitney I'm sorry, I don't know this. Have you published on Bagford yet?
Yeah, I'll share what I have,
Yeah,
and I
could
can
you
share
send it
images
to us?
too,
Because
even the
we'd love
portfolio
to
view and everything.
read it and bring you into the discussions.
Yeah.
That would be really nice, because it seems like a good contrast.
Let me go to now I think Davida had her hand up first, but she's now moved into second place. But I'm gonna, she took it down and put it back up, I think, so I'm gonna take the privilege of moderator to go with you first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, very fascinating. And what I'm wondering about is there other evidence, apart from the sale of the complete collection later, of a reputation for being the person who knows the theater, the theater scene, among friends or in correspondence or things like that? And because what's keeping me kind of going back and forth is, was this actually an effort to do something that might be of use to other people, or is this somehow just an effort to get a handle on, or to embrace that obscure object of desire, somehow to embrace the world of theater, which in and of itself is of some kind of huge attraction? So is it more of a personal expression of, love and an effort um, to hold, or is there actually an audience in mind, a use, a function?
I think both. I think that he's obsessed with the theater. I know in Sophie Colombo's book, I think she writes about there's a moment where I think he does a reading in one of the theater green rooms of a play, and it goes terribly, and it's really embarrassing for him. So maybe he had theater aspirations, but he's a deep fan. And again, he meets theater celebrities as a child. So to me, that makes sense from a collecting standpoint. But I think that his dedication to making especially the playbill volumes, accessible and usable, to me suggests that maybe he has other users or in mind, they really are fairly easy to navigate because they contain table of contents and yeah, it's easy to find information that you're looking for. So I think.
Yeah, is there any evidence that, he showed them to people or that people went to him to get answers to questions or anything like that?
We should reveal that we haven't yet looked at his correspondence. We think that
Okay.
is probably the next thing that we need to do. So
Yale.
yeah, we haven't gotten there yet. But that's our yeah. So we don't know.
Thank you.
Jay on Zoom.
Yes, thank you. Am I on?
You are, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I'm wondering, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. Have you looked at all of the collections of the Garrick Club? Because they have extensive collections of ephemera like this sort of thing, and additionally portraits. And I'm thinking about contemporaries of Burney, like Charles Matthews and Robertson, whose collections found their way into the Garrick collection. And by the way, of course, there was a lot of negotiation about the acquisition of the portraits. The widow, I think, of Robertson first offered them and they refused it. It was only eventually that they came in. But I was wondering how you would compare and contrast their collecting with Burney's theatrical collecting. And if I'm permitted a second question, I'm also quite fascinated to know what indications you had as to how he acquired things. So you differentiated between the London theaters and in that immediate region, and obviously he had access to them. You said he attended some of those performances, but the ones involving the troops where they were traveling, do we know whether he traveled with them or he had a member of the company who perhaps saved these? Did he have access to printers who were printing these playbills? That's my second question.
So for the Garrick Club, during right in between the first and second COVID outbreaks, we ransacked the Garrick Club.
Yeah, so we viewed all of the theater scrapbooks, including the Charles Matthews one that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I would call those theater scrapbooks in a more Victorian kind of way. Like I would say they are fan creations, less like histories of the stage like Burney.
Yeah.
Would you agree? I mean, they're similar though. Like they're clearly related.
Yeah, I would say honestly that their scope is more focused and more targeted. They're often focused on. Although again, it's been 4 or 5 years since I've looked at them. There were scrapbooks that chronicle different theaters and just try to think through that way. There are ones focused on specific actors like
Madame Vestries.
Yeah, like Madame Vestries. Actually, the ones that are most like Burney that I've run into is at the Islington Historical local history center. Are all there's a huge vast collection surrounding Joey Grimaldi and the Sadler's Wells Theater. And those scrapbooks, they aren't all in volumes, so it's kind of hard to think about them in the same way, but it's really clear that the compilers of that Grimaldi collection are thinking on almost on the same scope as Burney. Like there's everything from original musical scores and manuscript. There are huge collections of prints, ephemera, tickets. There's about 7,500 playbills. It's very comprehensive. Sorry to not give as good an answer as I should, but the key difference, I think, is scope. And weirdly, depending on the scope of what you want to begin collecting around, I think that the organizational strategies actually shift qualitatively.
And then I can answer the question about acquisition. So for the provincial playbills that you mentioned for specific troops, we know that these were printers' proofs that were circulated by the theater troupe to the printer because they contain corrections, usually in the future tense. So it's clear that they were from the troupe itself. We don't know how Burney got his hands on them from the troupe. And then we know that for many of the London ones, they were mailed to Burney by correspondence because they have postmarks or they're addressed to Burney himself. Yeah.
Isn't that, I mean, that in itself is kind of an answer to DeVito's question,
Yeah.
isn't it? That people
People
know.
knew.
People know
that
he's
they
like-
know he wants them. They're sending them to the
Yeah.
troops themselves now. I mean,
Yeah.
he's clearly at the center. But
And he's an amazingly networked individual. And because of his checkered past, he has several networks, right? Because he becomes at first a schoolmaster, but then a fairly well-known, well-connected, and even celebrated schoolmaster, ironically known for his discipline and old-fashioned rigor. I can't say that I like Charles Burney as a person very much. He seems to be kind of a jerk in many ways.
there was comment in the Zoom, Grace, and then we'll go to Lilian.
I'll go for it.
There's a comment from Jacqueline Reed Walsh saying fascinating and huge task. And Sophie Colombo has a question. She says, incredible. Thank you very much. This is extraordinary work. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the relationship of Cox's Fragmenta to the more clearly established 30 volumes.
We haven't looked at those volumes yet.
So-
Sorry, what are those?
We'd like to know too, because
This fragment.
Fragmenta, which is associated with this collection, but so far the British Library has not been willing to let us look at them. They say that they're very fragile, which we believe, but nevertheless, it would be great to, great, you're looking at them. Tell us about them, right? Get out your movie camera. Can we see? So I think Sophie has seen them. So I think we may have to, see if we can get Sophie to tell us about them, because so far we haven't had any luck. We have had some luck in calling up other stuff that had been off limits before. So again, this is what you think it is. It's very ad hoc and very sort of like, what are we, what's going to be the newest issue? Because there's so many volumes and they're so old.
Thank you so much. We have talked about the difference of two issues coming together, the autobiography and the theater history. But I want to come back to your initial remarks about the personal history of the stealing of the book. And I think this is maybe also to the point, because if you are a collector, you want to own something. Material objects you can own. You can own paintings, you can own art objects. But how do you own a performance? So instead of just focusing on ephemera that are collected, I would like to turn it around and think about the theater as an ephemera, as something that cannot be materially grasped. And you can see, or at least I sense, Burney's attempt to find a material presence that is collectible and constantly failing. And so the presence of the playbill, for example, yes, now I have something. It's not enough. And so whatever he takes is not enough. So I wonder whether his attempt would not just tell us something about a strange person, whether you like him or not, or the theater history, whatever it is, but also about the desire to catch something that has no material presence, like the theater, and define it. What is the theater for him? And he doesn't come up with a definition, but is constantly trying to.
Mhm.
That's how I see that.
I think that's really helpful. There's one or two things that come to mind, and I know that things are coming to mind for you. And there's also one tiny complication that I think makes this an even more interesting question. So on the one hand, I still find writing on the souvenir like that of Susan Stewart to be really useful here. I think often that when people talk about performance histories, they too often talk about it in elegiac tones, that this is, we're trying to replace something that's lost. We can never recover these lost performances. Isn't it sad? And in fact, there's such, right. And there's such, especially as you head in from the 18th and the 19th century, there's such an explosion of stuff that in many ways, one of the ways I've always tried to approach theater history is, can we please stop talking about loss? There's so much shit here, right? And no one spends time with it and actually tries to parse it, which is why I love your question. The one way I want to complicate it slightly is, I don't think we think in sociologically complex enough ways about theatrical experience. And the only way that I've written about this so far, and it was for the multigraph, collective project. There's an essay in there called Stages that I loved being part of the team that wrote, where we just started getting interested in all the ways that people interacted with print in the theater, right? They're going to this place where supposedly print doesn't exist, where we generate print in order to remember or capture or somehow preserve what happened up there. And yet they're interacting with print all the time. They're buying programs. They are reading review, they're reading last night's review. People had, they're buying books of the songs from the theater. They're bringing the text of Macbeth to see which lines get cut and which get screwed up. There are so many books and printed objects in the theater during, and at the illegitimate theaters, literally you have people with scrolls because they're not allowed to talk to say things like, oh yeah, yeah. And then they switch, oh yeah, right? I mean, or they're literally be saying, go away, right? I mean, so there's print all over the stage. And I think that really makes it even more interesting because there's so much print on the stage and the audience has their pockets full of books and pieces of paper and pencils and notebooks and writing down things. I mean, even Thomas Holcroft, when he was cribbing Colina in Paris in 1801, so they could run across the channel and make a lot of money with The Tale of Mystery, the first English melodrama in 1802, he was with his partner in crime with a notebook and pencil, writing down every line, every song, every musical refrain. So it's even more complex, the paper trail, than you think.
May I just follow up?
Yeah.
Because to some degree, you are arguing the opposite of the souvenir book.
Yeah.
Because it is not the nostalgia of capturing the memory of what was, but using material to understand of what is.
Yeah.
People read the program during a concert to know what they are hearing and not to remember what they heard the past time. And this kind of capturing the presence in some time, he can't keep up.
Mhm.
And playbills are so interesting because they're advertisements. That thing you're looking at is promising things that didn't necessarily happen. And yet, a year later or a day later, this is the only record we have, and we treat it as if this is what happened, even though maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I think your point about ownership is really smart. That the ephemera is a way of owning something that is otherwise not ownable. And that's, I think, really evocative. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I'm in the general ballpark of this discussion. I'm fascinated with playbills, which we don't have in our period.
No.
I guess I come across some, for example, plays written after people had read Walter Scott couldn't believe that he would marry, the wimpy Rowena and Rebecca would be neglected and have to go off back to the Orient. And so there were plays sprang up, right? Rebecca, Queen, alternative endings for all the rest of it. So can you use playbills in that way, that in a sense they represent the social pressure which eventually does create the drama. See what I'm saying? That they can be sociologically representative of certain popular moods. Is number one. And number two is he ever diverted in this collecting by events of major national and international importance, like the death of kings and all the rest of it? Are they noted? I mean, if they're not, that's is itself a testimony to believing that theatre is a genre. Theatre is a thing, so we're not going to be too distracted by other things.
Well, I don't think, at least in the playbill volumes, he doesn't note any other events. Does he in the notebooks? I don't think.
Oh,
No.
usually well, yes, he does note them, but it's the same way that like a good friend of mine's writing a book on Byron, where he's basically arguing that Byron is an occasional poet, that Byron's major poems are occasional poems in that way. And the way that he notes national events is because someone does a speech in celebration of the victory at Trafalgar, or the death of or the madness of a king, or the death of a king, or the attempted assassination of a king, or a victory, or a defeat. So where the theater commemorates the public event, that's instantly in the notebook, right? I mean, because you can see he's got an extra copy of the London, of the Times. He cuts out and pastes it in immediately. But there's a way in which the theater, it's not a distraction. It's, he's still got his, if the theater sees the national event, then it's worth notebooking.
I do think he sees theater history as maybe siloed from general history. I mean, I wondered that too, like at least in the table of contents and important events that he lists on the stage. Yeah, it's none of them are current events. Like it does seem to be that there aren't like competing timelines there, that he sees it as its own history of a particular medium. The other question about playbills, can you say more what you mean about that? About like them as a form of social
Scott stuff.
What I intuit is that a playbill, say about a play representing Rebecca, Princess of Jewry, whatever they want to call her, is a public reaction, a large public mood to Walter Scott got it wrong at the end of Ivanhoe. We want a better version. There's the people felt that very broadly. I felt that as a teenager myself. Can you intuit out of these playbills forms of social pressure, which then might eventuate in a new drama?
Yeah. I mean, I think you can. I mean, I think especially in playbills for melodrama, which we've looked a lot at. So the example that came to mind immediately for me was the melodramatic version of Joan of Arc has her being rescued from the pyre by her lover at the end. So I think you can see, especially after Waterloo, I mean, theater as a way of, I'm not the one who argued this, but like melodrama as lightening the public mood and making sense of the disaster that just occurred. And
I mean the same. And is it the Nahum Tate one where Cordelia doesn't die?
Yeah.
Right. Well, there's at least one version I've come across of the old Curiosity Shop where little Nell didn't die. Yeah. And she comes back at the end and the crowd goes wild, which is what you want, really.
This is so interesting. I was just fascinated by the different, let's say, ways in which you sum up generically what's at stake here. So a synergy between the codex and the actual season. That's one way. That was at the very beginning. Or at the end, you invoked Deleuze about how a great book is always chaos, that everything that leads, it is at once everything leads into it and goes out of it. I mean, it was just, those were just brilliant. And what I'm sensing is a kind of frustration in the project where, a big frustration, but so if one looks at other kinds of miscellaneous genres or miscellaneous productions, practices that are corporate, here I go back to the medieval miscellany, the miscellany, prior to miscellany. You can see from one miscellany to another that there's a kind of consistency of practice, right? And so the way in which you can judge how this product constitutes a certain kind of a genre and a certain reliable set of practices is that there's comparison that can go between one corporate project and another corporate project. I mean, you could say the same thing about any kind of copying system or printing system there, where there's a corporate project. And here, what you've got is this individual eccentric. And I just wonder, therefore, what can be the comparanda for you? You know, I mean, in a sense that you can't, you know, with a Friars Battalion, you say they did this way at Hereford, and they did it this way at Lincoln, and they did it this way someplace else, and so on. And so you come up with a totality of practice, right? And so I just wonder, this is more of a comment, but I just wonder if you would comment on the kinds of frustrations that are at stake in working this vast chronicle / autobiography / I don't know, outward history of one eccentric. You know, I mean, that it just strikes me as, I mean, it's such a strange production. You have to make sense of it.
Well, it's interesting because I think our frustration mirrors Burney's apparent frustration with trying to document the history of the stage, and the frustration that's evident in his like different ways of organizing material and then starting over again. And yeah, and I think, I mean, this has been a really hard collection for us to theorize because, you know, it's like Michael said in his part of the talk, he's using like Enlightenment organizational methods of his materials, but then he's also like creating what we now know as like Victorian scrapbooks. He's also using commonplace methods. But then at the same time, I think the thing that complicates it most of all is the fact that it's a collection. So we want to theorize the collection as a whole, that this would be an easier project. It was just about, you know, just the notebooks. But I think that, so it's also part of the period's collecting projects along with the note-taking projects. So it's something that, first of all, we had a lot of secondary reading to do for this, which has been a lot about all of these different genres together.
It does seem as if this chronic collecting impulse is continually contradicted and shot through by this diachronic impulse to get to work through history and to notate every historical moment. That's I mean, I'm sure that just and the two are ineffectively melded in this.
I mean, following up on that, I was thinking about this because of the whole aspect of collecting is that if you're trying to tell it chronological, but you're constantly finding
Yes,
things
exactly.
that, you know, that you didn't know were out there or they come in, and how do you integrate into something bigger like that? I mean, that's a question that I would have raised, is that very integration or interfiling, or how that was happening with these.
I think he really does just pay, like, well, you might have a better answer, but from what I could tell in those early slides where you can see he's created these little pamphlets and then he starts cutting them up again, but then at a certain point he just sticks one in. I think, and that other one that we found, and there are a couple of instances of this where it's clear he has a sort of day book where he just pastes stuff in, and then he's going to, or just collect it and then and then he's going to reapportion it later. That's why we think that the volumes, as we got to look at them, are done later in the game, or at least they aren't done initially. They're like either 2.0 or 3.0 or something, because he's really trying to say, I think I need this much space for this. And he also, there are times where he's utterly extravagant. Like there's one instance where he must have had so many copies of the Monthly Mirror because he pastes in one page of the Monthly Mirror, and rather than just doing it on the edge so you could do that, he then takes a second copy of the same page and turns it over so you can read both pages, right? So at points he's extravagant, and at other points he's really cheap, right? So it's clear that he gets a deal on a certain kind of tabulated book that goes month by month, a sort of calendar, like those old Sierra Club calendars that we used to buy before, you know, we had iCalendar or something, where he gets a deal, right? So he must have, you know, gotten a deal on 50 of these. The problem is that some Januaries there's not enough pages, right? So yeah, so it's really funny how it's hard to know. Like at points he wants to create the biggest, most beautiful scaffolding where everything will fit, and at other points he's found a deal and this is what he's got to work.
Well, it reminds me of the Pastorius beehive.
Yeah, of course, we're all thinking about that.
Yeah, too, because it's like
Project bus.
too little, too much?
Yep.
How do you fit this when you start,
Yeah.
and you see that all over the place, you know, people have cookbooks and they start with an alphabet and then there's like nothing for, you got A and then nothing under B and, you know.
How far does he go back? It starts what?
1660. And
Oh.
and actually some stuff goes back to Elizabethan.
Okay.
Like he's collecting materials for Elizabethan. They're sparse.
Mhm.
What's also weird, Lynn, is there is a kind of weird affect
Mhm.
involved here, and it's probably my own, but you know, we get things from the page where the volumes where he's clearly created a new system, right? And he's going to fill it. And there are volumes that are overstuffed, and those feel to me really joyous. And then there's a whole succession of volumes where they're really sparse, where it's clear that he just never got around to filling them, and they feel so sad to me, right? So you're pulling a dozen volumes thinking, oh, this will take me all day, and you sort of go and it's like, and after 40 minutes, you're
Done.
great. I have to call up the next 12 and wait an hour for them, you know. So there's a weird, I don't know how to write about it, but other than there's the sort of energy of the palimpsestic
Yeah.
thing. And there's a way in which the way that you can see him pasting things and layering things is in itself so inventive. There's a kind, I do think he gets a lot of joy out of the abundance. And I think that if he were going to write that history of the stage, it would be about that abundance. But that's just something that's literally, you know, me feeling all the feels as I'm working through volume after volume.
I
And
think it's strange too that he doesn't pick a stopping date. Like sure, that makes sense to go back to an older time, but like he's on death's door in 1816. He's still putting playbills together. Like the history just,
Yeah.
it's just this continual project.
Really the hope that somebody will take on.
Yeah, that
after
seems.
him.
Yeah, Pastorius wanted that too, never happens.
Right, the sun's never.
Never
gonna
is.
take it. Well, on that note.
Thank you.
well, thank you all. This was really fun.
Thank you.
Yes, the scrapbooks are really cool.
What